Hi everyone, my name is Marcel Thomas. Thanks for taking the time to watch this short video about my book, Local Lives, Parallel Histories, Villages and Everyday Life in a Divided Germany. I wanted to be part of such a strong shortlist with some really fantastic publications on it. I want to take a few minutes today to talk you through my book and give you a brief introduction. Local Lives, Parallel Histories is a book that plays with scale throughout. At its heart, it's a book about two villages. At the same time, it's also a book about the Cold War and a divided Germany. It's a book about the ways in which the extraordinary history of the 20th century was shaped and experienced through the very ordinary history of local life. The book is the first comparative study of rural localities in a divided Germany. And I want to start off by introducing you to the two villages that take center stage. You can see them here on the map. Ebersbach, about 35 kilometers east of Stuttgart, which during the Cold War was located in the capitalist West Germany. And Neukirch, about 40 kilometers east of Dresden, which was located in the socialist dictatorship of East Germany. These two villages are not special, unique cases at all. In fact, they are quite ordinary villages, which were in many ways typical of small localities in post-war Germany. On the surface, they illustrate the very different living conditions and developments of communities in East and West during the Cold War. Ebersbach, which you can see here on a postcard from the 1930s, offers the typical West German success story of economic growth. In 1945, it was a medium-sized village with a relatively homogeneous traditional community. It had about 6,000 inhabitants back then. The village experienced extraordinary growth in the two post-war decades and almost tripled its population. It was subsequently granted town status in 1975. Today, it is an affluent and diverse commuter town with almost 15,000 inhabitants. So in many ways, Ebersbach shows this typical West German success story of economic recovery, democratization, and cultural diversity. In the East, on the other hand, it is much more a history of stagnation and shortages. Neukirch was slightly bigger than Ebersbach in 1945, with almost 7,000 inhabitants. But in the socialist era, the village was restructured according to the regime's vision of the socialist village. Its factories were nationalized, its agriculture was collectivized, a village club and other institutions of socialist culture were established. And the most visible impact of this restructuring were the housing blocks, which were constructed between 1954 and 1989, which you can see here at the bottom of the photograph. Unlike Ebersbach, Neukirch kept its population relatively stable at just over 7,000 until the end of the 1970s when a steep decline began. Today, Neukirch has just under 5,000 inhabitants, and it's struggling with unemployment and demographic change. So, from the perspective of the outsider, my two case studies seem to exemplify the diverging developments of the socialist East and the capitalist West. They seem to confirm the textbook narrative of a Cold War antagonism. But there is another side to the story which historians have hardly explored so far. If we look at the post-war histories of these two villages through the eyes of the locals, they suddenly begin to appear much more similar. And this is where my book comes in. I have used oral history interviews with 20 locals in each village and a range of archival material to offer a different bottom-up perspective to the grand narrative of a Cold War divergence in East and West. I show that despite the very different social and political circumstances, there are what I call parallel histories of responses to social change in the divided Germany. Let me give you some examples to illustrate what I mean by that. In my book, I examine several key themes of change that shaped rural life in Cold War Germany. For example, I show that Easterners and Westerners had similar attitudes to rural modernization. From the early 1950s to the mid-1970s, progress was envisioned as a move away from the rural. Germans wanted their villages to look urban, and the two localities were remodeled accordingly. But from the mid-1970s onwards, Easterners and Westerners rediscovered the positive sides of rurality and actively promoted them again. Easterners and Westerners also shared an ambivalent attitude towards the dissolution of the rural community, as it's usually referred to. After the Second World War, Germans on both sides of the inner German border desired more privacy and abandoned social spaces that were associated with the old village community. The villagers were complicit in this dissolution of this community, but they also instantly began to lament its loss. So there's a shared history of longing for this traditional rural community of the past. I'm also interested in local activism. I show that in democracy as well as in dictatorship, locals increasingly partnered with the state to achieve tangible change in their localities, often through volunteering, grassroots action, or petitioning. Finally, my book also has a chapter on migration, which shows how villagers in East and West tried to exclude subsequent waves of newcomers, including ethnic German refugees, foreign workers, and urban commuters from their communities. And there's also a chapter on memory, which goes beyond the cliche of the nostalgic villagers and shows how Neukirchers and Ebersbachers engaged with history as a means of shaping the present and the future of their locality. So to sum up, my book has three major implications for our understanding of modern European societies. First of all, it challenges the traditional understanding of Cold War societies as mirror images. It encourages us to question the dominant focus on opposites in the Cold War and to more carefully explore what also linked experiences in East and West. Secondly, it emphasizes that post-war Germans engage with large-scale changes through local meanings. My research reminds us to pay attention to the local, despite the rush to the transnational in recent years. Thirdly, it challenges understandings of the rural as the traditional other in modern society. Rural life is normally seen as backwards, as agricultural, as traditional, as boring. But my research complicates these associations of the rural with tradition and the urban with modernity. And if there's one thing that I would want readers to take away from my book, it is this realization that there's so much more that we can learn from the local histories of these seemingly ordinary localities. Thank you for watching this, and thank you for your interest in my book.